Hello and welcome back to my Nissan NV200 van conversion. I'm really excited to share how I built this new table side unit with integrated battery pack for charging my devices. And this all begins with removing the existing table. I recently put out a video about how I made this old table, and it's a really easy, cheap setup, so do check that one out after this. I've split this video into two parts. In this first video I'll be building the table unit, and in the next part I'll be kitting it out with storage, so do keep an eye out for that. Let's get into the build. I began by measuring up for the front section of the table, but while I do this, let's have a look at my plans for the build. I created a design of how I wanted it to look in Sketchup, and the idea is to stick with the fold down table concept which I've used previously, and this table will be cut out of the front section, but making it all much neater with added storage and a place for my battery pack, and for it to match the wheel arch storage box that I made previously. I've seen many vans with side units going all the way down to the floor, but I want to retain the full width of my 3-section pull-out bench bed, which is king size and very comfortable, so having the table unit suspended allows a gap for the bed and the mattress, plus a bit of sleeping room. I will be using a couple of pine boards again for this build, as these are made in useful sizes and are cheaply available, so I purchased two at 175 by 50 centimeters. To get the width I needed for the front section, I cut a 65 centimeter length piece off each board so they could be joined. With my measurements made, I made a note of which side would be the face and could make my first cuts using a circular saw and a straight edge. With both boards cut to 65 centimeters, I cleaned up the edges and then passed both boards to be joined over the planer to get a perfectly flat edge. I could then mark where my dowels would go. I didn't dowel along the whole length of the board, as I would be cutting the table out from this piece later on and I didn't want to hit a dowel, though I do strengthen the rest of the join later on. Using a collar on a 6mm bit, I drilled 2 holes and inserted dowel pins before wet weather forced me inside, which would be the theme throughout this build. I lined up both boards and gave a tap with a hammer to create a mark on the opposing board with the pins and could drill dowel holes in the second board. With the dowels inserted, I could check the join and it was a really nice fit. All that was left was to create 3 more dowel holes using the same process and glue it up. While I finish this, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel. As well as the long clamps, I also added clamps and weights to the face of the boards to ensure they would dry flat. Whilst that dried, I moved on to the side pieces. With the van wall being a very uneven surface, I created templates with 2 big bits of cardboard and trimmed them down to get a good fit. Just to make things a little trickier, where I would be attaching the unit on the left is actually 40mm further forward than on the right, so this had to be accounted for. Next I drew up the templates onto the wood. Using a combination of the jigsaw and circular saw, I cut them out and repeatedly went back to the van to check the fit, and could make small adjustments to the various curves and notches as necessary. With the side pieces cut, I could begin something that I had mentioned in an earlier video, building in my portable battery pack for easy access charging. The first step here was to work out where the battery pack would sit. This would be facing out of the left side piece, and I created a template of it onto the wood based on the face of the battery pack. I then made the shape smaller by 10mm on each side, and this is to give the battery a ledge to sit against without falling out of the opening. I drew the rounded edges on and then cut the opening out with a jigsaw. I used a router to reduce the thickness of the wood on the inside, and this is so the sockets of the battery are nearer the front and more accessible. I freehanded this, and although it's fairly messy, it's on the inside and will never be seen. After refining the edge with some hand sanding, I could then neaten up the front of the opening with a round over on the router. And this is where I messed up. I had the router bit set up for the full thickness of the 18mm wood and not the 10mm that I'd reduced it to, so the bearing didn't touch the wood and took a big gouge out of the side. There wasn't much I could do to fix it, so I finished the round over with a different bit. I then sanded it as best as possible to try and salvage the opening. We'll see how that looks at the end of the video. And on that somewhat frustrating note, I jumped back to the front piece and cutting the table from the board I had glued up earlier. I started by prepping the board with a thorough sand to smooth it over. Next, I cut a straight edge along the bottom that I could work from, and then could trim a bit off both sides to get the width down from 100cm to 81cm, which is as big as I felt I could fit in the van. After that, I drew up all the notches I would need to remove for it to fit to the ceiling of the van, and this included the opening for the top shelf. For this shelf, I started with a plunge cut on the circular saw against the straight edge, and then I could jigsaw the rest of the material out. The other notches followed to match shapes on the van wall and ceiling, and then I could begin the part of the build I was most worried about, cutting the table out of the board. I did these cuts on the circular saw in 2 passes, to try and preserve the edges of the wood on both sides and prevent tear out. The first side was a case of cutting up to a certain point, but the other side, due to the fact that the circular saw wouldn't pass over my clamps, had to be another plunge cut. Cutting the top involved another plunge cut with 2 passes. I used a jigsaw bit specifically meant for tight corners, and it did a great job of joining up the cuts I'd made. Being thinner than the circular saw blade, it gave me a bit of leeway to sand it down at a later date. Despite this section of the build being pretty stressful, as this was my front piece and table which I really didn't want to mess up, it turned out really well. I could now refine the edges with sanding. If you noticed the 2 pocket holes on the front piece whilst I was cutting earlier, these are just to provide a bit more support to the join I made in the boards and will be hidden on the inside when the table is assembled. I plugged them with pine dowels and sanded them flush off camera. I could finally get some structure to the table unit by adding pocket holes to the side pieces so they could be attached to the front frame. I used pocket holes on my previous wheel arch storage box build, and they provided such a quick and strong way to put the furniture together that I decided to use them again. Clamping the side pieces in place, I screwed them along the edges of the front piece to create this arched structure. The next piece to cut was the top shelf, once again with a couple of notches removed so that it would fit nicely in the van. Once cut and sanded, I added pocket holes and screwed it into the unit, making sure the bottom of the shelf was flush with the top of the table opening. This shelf would have the addition of a back piece, which I'm calling the upper brace, and this would allow an area for the table to be attached to the van wall. Due to the corners of the van, the back piece didn't stretch all the way along, but as long as it met the screw threads in the van walls, then this didn't matter. I set about screwing this in and then could begin work on the base. I created the base in the same way as the top shelf, and with a bit of refinement I got it to a good fit. If you're wondering how the table is suddenly on the wall, then the process looked a little like this. With a lot of this, until eventually I managed to get one bolt in. I propped up the other side with wood so I didn't need to hold it. Back with the base, it was time to cut a recess for my piano hinge to sit in, and this is so when the table is folded up it sits flush with the rest of the front. I chose a piano hinge as I'd already used one on my wheel arch storage box, and so they would match nicely. After a plunge cut with the circular saw, I could work my way along to my mark and finish the recess off with a jigsaw. I gave the entire base a sand, and as I was about to attach the base, I noticed a crack on the wood at the bottom of the left side. This is a thin area, so it's understandable, but it was still a bit disappointing. I worked some wood glue into the area and clamped it, so hopefully that does the trick. With that dried, I marked out where my screws would go and loaded the board with pocket holes on the underside, as I figured this would be the side least likely to be seen. With the structure of the table finally coming together, I could attach the hinge to the front recess. I marked out, pre-drilled and screwed in 2 screws to make sure I had it straight, and then continued to do the same with the rest of the screws. I needed to fix the lower area of the unit to the van wall, and so another brace was needed. This time it required an angled edge to accommodate the corner of the van. With this lower brace screwed into the base, I put 2 bolts into the threads of the van and put some pencil lead on their heads. I then held up the unit, made sure it was level, and gave a couple of sharp taps to the bolts to transfer them up to where I should drill my holes, which I proceeded to do. I was now at a stage where I could take care of a few final bits before sanding and varnishing. I did these before attaching the table, as it would be much easier without the table in the way. I undid the pocket holes and got some wood glue in the joints, and then, after screwing it all back together, got some 9mm diameter dowel plugs that I had pre-cut to fill the pocket holes in places where they might be seen, like the top shelf, inside the side unit and on the base. Once the glue had dried, I sanded them all down flush with the wood. I was now ready to attach the table, so I carefully aligned it, then fixed it from one point on each end of the hinge to get it level before fully attaching it. It was a good fit overall, though the corners were a little tight, which I had expected, so I fitted the rest of the screws before taking some time to work on the table edges and make sure they gave a good fit. I could then attach a couple of magnets, and these again are the same ones I used on my wheel arch storage box, which each have a 6kg pull. Once aligned, I drilled my pilot holes and carefully screwed them in, and they do a brilliant job of holding the table in place, and can be adjusted to get the table sitting at the right depth. I then attached these eye plates using the same method. I've been so impressed with the strength and support given to my previous van table, which used ropes from the ceiling, that I wanted to incorporate an updated version of this in the new table. I looked at nearly every possible way of supporting a table, including folding shelf brackets, fold-out arms and piston stays, but found myself continually coming back to rope or wire attachments. Although it would have been nice not to have these wires, I've never found them to be in the way, and if I'm going to be cooking on this table, then I want the strongest possible support for it. I gave the table a final sand and went over all the edges to take care of any splinters. Though the magnets are very strong, I need the latch to ensure that the door doesn't fall open under any circumstances, and it also provides a handle with which to pull the table down. Finally, I gave the whole unit 3 coats of polyurethane varnish to protect the wood and sanded in between coats. At long last I was ready to install the table in the van. For this I used all 5 of the M6 screw threads built into the wall and purchased some high tensile bolts that would secure it in place, along with penny washers to help distribute the load and protect the wood. And the table is solid. To hold the table in place, I found a couple of picture hanging wires on Amazon, which are really smart and each have an adjustable clip on one end, which could prove handy if I'm parked up on uneven ground. Once the table was level, I cut the wires shorter, leaving a little extra length. With the table secure, I could now add the battery, and despite the wonky edge, it worked out really well. It's great to finally have the power built in and is easily accessible. So that's my new van table built and installed. As you can see, the bed fits between the storage chest below and the table above with ease, and there's plenty of room to spare, meaning that I haven't had to compromise on my bed. In part 2 of this video, I'll be adding storage, a protective holder for the battery so it doesn't slide around, as well as a few other ideas that I've had to make the space as practical as possible for the van. As always, thanks for watching, and please do subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so you can keep up to date with all my latest van videos.